Creating misimpressions. Throughout the Cold War years, the framework of defense against communist aggression was available to mobilize domestic support for subversion, terror, and mass slaughter. In the 1980s, however, the device was beginning to wear thin. By 1979, according to one careful estimate, the Soviets were influencing only 6% of the world population and 5% of the world GNP outside its borders. But details aside, the basic picture was becoming harder to evade. There were also domestic problems, notably the civilizing effects of the activism of the 1960s, which had many consequences, among them less willingness to tolerate the resort to violence, well understood by the political leadership, as leaked documents and other sources reveal. The task of creating the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting was facing obstacles. The Reagan administration's public relations system sought to deal with the problem by fevered pronouncements about the evil empire and its tentacles everywhere about to strangle us. A simplified version of Kennedy's monolithic and ruthless conspiracy to conquer the world. But new devices were needed. The Reaganites declared a worldwide campaign to destroy the evil scourge of terrorism, Reagan, particularly state-backed international terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself, in a return to barbarism in the modern age. George Shultz. The official list of states sponsoring terrorism, initiated by Congress in 1979, was elevated to a prominent place in policy and propaganda, with delicate choices of the kind already illustrated. When Gorbachev's public relations became a more serious threat to American interests, as Huntington warned, and the conventional pretexts eroded, the war on drugs quickly filled the vacuum in Latin America. The traditional domain of U.S. direct or indirect violence, later transmuted to narco-terrorism, exploiting opportunities offered by 9/11. By the end of the millennium, total U.S. military and police assistance in the hemisphere exceeded economic and social aid. This is a new phenomenon, the analysts point out. Even at the height of the Cold War, economic aid far exceeded military aid. Predictably, the policies strengthened military forces at the expense of civilian authorities, exacerbated human rights problems, and generated significant social conflict and even political instability. From 2002 to 2003, the number of Latin American troops trained by U.S. programs increased by more than 50%. The U.S. military's Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, now has more people working in Latin America than most key civilian federal agencies combined, focusing now on radical populism and street gangs as major threats. The police are being trained in light infantry tactics. Foreign military training is being shifted from the State Department to the Pentagon, freeing it from human rights and democracy conditionality under congressional supervision. In September 1989, just as the Berlin Wall was about to crumble, Bush I redeclared the war on drugs with a huge government media propaganda campaign. It went into effect right in time to justify the invasion of Panama, to kidnap a thug who was convicted in Florida for crimes committed mostly when he was on the CIA payroll, and incidentally killing unknown numbers of poor people in the bombarded slums. Thousands, according to the victims. The war on drugs also had an important domestic component, much like the war on crime. It served to frighten the domestic population into obedience, as domestic policies were being implemented to benefit extreme wealth at the expense of the large majority. In 1994, Clinton expanded the category of terrorist states to include rogue states. A few years later, another concept was added to the repertoire: failed states, from which we must protect ourselves and which we must help, sometimes by devastating them. Later came the axis of evil, which we must destroy in self-defense, following the will of the Lord, as transmitted to his humble servant. Meanwhile, escalating the threat of terror, nuclear proliferation, and perhaps apocalypse soon. The rhetoric has always raised difficulties, however. The basic problem is that under any reasonable interpretation of the terms, even official definitions, the categories are unacceptably broad, implicating the United States rather than justifying its actions, as faithfulness to doctrine requires. It takes discipline not to recognize the element of truth in historian Arno Mayer's immediate post-9/11 observation that since 1947, America has been the chief perpetrator of preemptive state terror and innumerable other rogue actions causing immense harm, always in the name of democracy, liberty, and justice. The concept of rogue states is no less problematic. By the late Clinton years, it was evident that for much of the world, the United States was becoming the rogue superpower, considered the single greatest external threat to their societies, and that, in the eyes of much of the world, in fact, the prime rogue state today is the United States. After Bush took over, mainstream scholarship no longer just reported world opinion, but began to assert as fact that the United States has assumed many of the very features of the rogue nations against which it has done battle. Though kept at bay by the doctrinal institutions, the difficulties are always lurking in the background. Problems are also raised by invoking the war on drugs to fill the vacuum left by the erosion of traditional pretexts. One is that the most cost-effective and humane approaches, prevention and treatment, are consistently neglected in favor of radical increase of incarceration at home and violence abroad, with little if any effect on drug prices, hence use. Another is the casual relation between U.S. violence abroad and the drug trade, well established by scholarship, and even evident from the daily press, recently again in Afghanistan. It is useful to recall, however, that no narco-trafficking enterprise begins to approach that of 19th century Britain, a mainstay of the empire. Similar problems beset the category failed state. Like terrorist state and rogue state, the concept is frustratingly imprecise, susceptible to too many interpretations. Again, careful shaping of evidence is required to exclude the United States, while including the intended examples. Take Haiti, a prototypical failed state. The standard version in much scholarship, and almost invariably in the media, is that Clinton's intervention in 1994 to restore democracy has regrettably not led to democracy, but instead to political chaos, renewed repression, and dismal U.S.-Haiti relations. Also standard, as in this case, is avoidance of the relevant facts, specifically those revealing that Clinton's invasion was just another step in Washington's efforts to undermine Haitian democracy, leading to chaos and repression, as was predicted at once. The category failed state was invoked repeatedly in the course of the normative revolution proclaimed in the self-designated enlightened states in the 1990s, entitling them to resort to force, with the alleged goal of protecting the populations of carefully selected states in a manner that may be illegal but legitimate. As the leading themes of political discourse shifted from humanitarian intervention to the redeclared war on terror after 9/11, the concept failed state was given a broader scope to include states like Iraq that allegedly threatened the United States with weapons of mass destruction and international terrorism. In scholarship that approvingly traces the historical roots of the Bush Doctrine, the concept failed state has been extended to include the power vacuums that the United States has been forced to fill for its own security, as Americans concentrated on the task of felling trees and Indians, and of rounding out their natural boundaries. Under this broader usage, failed states need not be weak. Iraq was not considered a failed state that threatened U.S. security because it was weak. One legal authority writes that the aggressive, arbitrary, tyrannical, or totalitarian state would equally be regarded as having failed, at least according to the norms and standards of modern-day international law. And that makes good sense. Nazi Germany